Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome back. Hope everybody's doing well, feeling good, and staying warm. We were just talking about that. Today's a nice day, actually. It's like 35, 38 degrees. It's beautiful out there compared to what it was yesterday. Um, and as I like to joke, growing up in the Midwest, this is just like, it's like January. It's just January. It's fine. But to Alabamians, it's a little different. So I understand. So welcome back. We're on the second half of chapter 6 on Revelation, in which Rabbi Artson's going to now that the first half he kind of gave a process overview of Revelation generally, and now he's going to try to apply it a little more specifically um, to Torah. So before I had started recording, Stuart had a question. So now that we're official, Stuart, if you want to
Well,
re-ask the question
yeah.
for those who were not present.
Well, on page 48 of the text, the book itself, we're discussing the Torah wisdom revealed through the prism of process. And I think this first part begs the question of who wrote the Torah. I mean, we think of the Torah as being some sort of balance of being written by humans and by God. But what is your concept, Rabbi, of actually how the Torah was written?
So Rabbi Artson here makes a statement here at the beginning that the Torah's history of compilation and editing is best understood through the documentary hypothesis. How many of you are familiar with the documentary hypothesis? One person. Excellent. So the documentary hypothesis dates back to mid-late 19th century, when a biblical scholar, usually it's attributed to Julius Wellhausen, who kind of made the observation that there are some internal contradictions in the Torah. And he begins to posit, and the hypothesis gets developed further, that there are in fact multiple authors of the Torah. Most commonly, the way it's usually identified is there are 4 strands. One is usually called E. It is probably the oldest and centered in the north, was probably written in the northern kingdom of Israel around the 8th century BCE, give or take, maybe 9th century BCE. And it's called E because it primarily uses God's name as Elohim in the text. There seems to be a parallel document to that was written in the southern kingdom of Judah, probably around the same time, maybe a slightly later. That's usually called J. That also tells the story and the ancient history in slightly different ways, and primarily uses God's name as Yud He Vav He, what we call Adonai, which if you're German, there's no Y, so it becomes a J, which is why it's called the J. Those seem to take up most of the narrative parts of the. There are 2 additional texts that get layered in. One is called P, which stands for the priestly. So a lot of the laws and rules and such that deal with what the priests and the Kohanim are supposed to do and the sacrificial worship and things around the temple, that's mostly attributed to the P document. because it's generally considered to be instructions for the priest. So most of Leviticus is the P document. Um, and the last one is called D, and pretty much is the book of Deuteronomy, hence D. And the theory is that these four documents were kind of being around ancient Israel for a while until the Babylonian exile. And then when the people returned from the Babylonian exile, whether it was done while in exile or soon upon their return to the land, the four documents kind of got interwoven together into one document, which is more or less what we call the Torah today. Some posit that there's an R, a redactor, who is the one who kind of, might have inserted some phrasing and some extra text to kind of help connect the dots with each other. But that seems to be, since the mid-late 19th century, when Wellhausen published his book, that seems to be the prevailing hypothesis and assumption among biblical scholars of how, or I should say, historically, how the Torah was written. Questions so far? I know I have not entirely answered your question yet, Stuart. I'm working on it. Everybody good so far?
I would say that I guess I did know about the documentary theory. I just didn't know that's what it was called.
One of the modern proponents of it, who explains it well as an author and scholar, Richard Elliott Friedman. He wrote a book called, I think it's Who Wrote the Bible, I think is the name of the book, which really kind of lays it out in a less academic way and a much more accessible way. If you get really bored, he has a translation of the Torah in which he color codes which parts come from which document. So if you really get bored, you can kind of flip through and see what's J, what's E, what's P, what's D, and flip through. It's kind of fun. I don't know it's super particularly useful, but it's, unless you're a biblical scholar, but it's kind of a fun book to flip through. Yes, Stuart.
So just to get this a little bit more concrete, I mean, the events that are in the Torah occurred a lot earlier, hundreds of years before that 800 BCE date you gave us, for instance. So this must have been, there's two questions for me. Was this an oral history until then, oral history that was passed down, or did the people who wrote it actually say that God told them what this was and they were just writing down God's words? So how did all that happen?
Are you asking as like an academic, in an academic sense, or in a theological sense?
Probably academic.
So in an academic sense, what they probably would argue is much, I guess, I've been kind of out of the biblical criticism world for a while, but my guess is what they would generally respond is much the same way as the Greeks were writing down legends and mythology about the world long after it happened. It's kind of the same basic process. They had these stories, whether or not they were based on even earlier documents that we just no longer have extent of. That's actually probable, because there are books referenced in the Torah that we have no records of whatsoever. And there's snippets of other things in the Torah that clearly are part of a larger story that we just don't have access to. For example, like one of the classic ones is the very beginning of Genesis 6, where it talks about angels coming down and having children with women, like human women, and giving birth to the Rephidim, etc. Like, clearly, there's a larger legend there that we don't have, and that's lost to history. So there's probably what they did in compiling these documents is they took kind of the most important parts and left it in, and kind of cut the rest along the way. But there are references to other books periodically, and they say, particularly when you get to like Kings, it says, like, if you want to know more, look in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, which is a book that doesn't exist anymore. So in some sense, there was probably some oral history that they're basing it of. It's possible that there were some earlier documents that have been lost to history that they were basing it on. It's just a little hard to know for sure because we don't have it to be able to base it on. Other questions about the hypothesis before we go on? Yes, Joshua.
I was just going to say, for the non-academic counterpoint, Jonathan Sachs had a really good lecture about the documentary hypothesis and sort of his, I guess, humanistic and orthodox reasons for rejecting it utterly as a matter of principle. So I'm not a huge fan of the documentary hypothesis, mostly I think because people forget the hypothesis part very much. So like if you're talking about literary criticism, it can make sense, but they reify it in a way that forgets that it's actually lost very much in the deep mysteries of time of when it got written down and in what form.
Yes. So good point that documentary hypothesis is exactly that. It's a hypothesis. You can't actually prove it. And there are biblical scholars who don't actually hold by it. So, I had one teacher who subscribed to what he called the progressive hypothesis, which understood that rather than, 4 documents being mushed together at some point, they were kind of layered over time. So, there was kind of a base layer of story, and then another layer was put on top of it, and then another layer on top of that, and another layer, and they just kind of gradually got woven together. And then there are scholars, Robert Alter being one of the prominent ones, who argue that, it's really just one artfully designed document overall, and that you just have to know how to read it properly to be able to understand the conflicts and the contradictions, but that it's really just should be read as one masterfully written piece of literature, not as 4 separate ones. So nobody knows, and as Joshua kind of said, it's what actually happened is long lost to history, short of us uncovering a single document. We're never really going to know. And the chances of that as time goes on becomes significantly less because of just the nature of what they were writing on and with, and weather conditions. Things are just going to deteriorate over time. So now, coming back to the book for a moment. So what Rabbi Artson seems to want to agree with the documentary hypothesis, but does make an interesting statement. So he says the Torah's history is best understood through the documentary hypothesis, but the method of delivery doesn't preclude our intuition that this Torah is the Torah selected and created by the God of Israel and selected and created by the people of Israel. What does that mean? That's kind of an open question if you guys want to try to answer it. But
It's
That's a good open question.
Yes.
I think it means it didn't have to come down in a bolt of lightning to Moses at one moment to be a divine and human product.
Right. And not just that, but if you're going to buy the documentary hypothesis and buy into it, then it's not coming to as a bolt of lightning, as you said, to any of the four authors, but that, I'll put it this way. The documentary hypothesis is often used as a way of saying the Torah is not divine.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's just like it's like Shakespeare. It's not really worth the study. And I think what he's trying to argue is actually you can accept the documentary hypothesis and still see God's role as part of this. And see that there's a way in which God is revealing God's self to humanity, and humanity's trying to translate that experience into words, which is the Torah as we have it.
And I think the argument that kind of solidifies this for me is that the oral Torah is considered as divine as the written Torah, the original Torah. And that implies that there's this ongoing interpretation, and that's equally valid. So
Yes.
I like that argument.
Yes. Rabbi Elliot Dorff makes that argument in a slightly different way. And I think I've shared this before. If you look at the blessings before and after the Torah reading, it says, Asher Natan Lanu Torah Temet, that God gave us the true Torah in the past tense, as in it was given at a moment at Sinai. But at the very end, we say, Baruch Atah Notein HaTorah, who gives the Torah in the present tense. In that, Sinai was a particular moment in time, but God is still giving and revealing the Torah to us constantly in the present tense every time we're reading it, which is similar to it's along the line of what you're saying as well.
Is it too much of a simplification to say that the Torah is whatever the person reading it wants it to be, because it changes depending on their attitudes?
I wouldn't go that far, because there are rules for Torah interpretation. Otherwise, there's nothing stopping me of jumping in and saying, well, this is just, a precursor to Jesus and his resurrection, which Christians do, and that's part of their methods of interpretation, but it's kind of outside the bounds of Jewish theology. So you can't necessarily just say, Torah is whatever you want it to be as you're reading it. You can, however, say, Torah will speak to you differently every time you read it. So it's the proverbial, not walking in the same river twice, right? Like, right now you might read something in Parshat Va'era this Shabbat that speaks to you. In 3 years, because we're on a triennial cycle, in 3 years when we get back to that Parsha in this section, something else might speak to you very differently. God willing, that's what happens.
But the laws of interpretation are not known by the average Jewish person in the street. or Jewish person in the pew picking it up and looking at it each week?
Well, they are in the Siddur. They are in the prayer book. So, you can look them up they're at the beginning of Shacharit, before Psukei de Zimra. So, probably about
And nobody's
page.
ever there for Sukei de Zimra. So, no
Page
wonder.
12 in the daily prayer book.
It's in the daily prayer book. I think it's in the Shabbat one too. I'd have to double check. I could double check. I have one somewhere around here. But
Wait, what's in it?
Those laws
the
that none of
the
us know.
13 principles of interpretation.
Give me
Yes,
5 of
Lisa.
them.
Gives a real headache to try to read them, by the way.
It is a little bit of a headache to try to read them, because unless you know what they're actually trying to say, unless you get some case examples, they're kind of,
Yeah, and
they're a little
even
hard to understand.
after looking at case examples 5 times each, it's still hard to remember what they're saying.
Can we make a little insert that I can have where it just says, pasted in the front inside cover? This is this, and this. This is the laws for using this material. These are the laws for using it.
I don't remember what page they're on in the Daily Sitter. It's
Oh.
right before the Kaddish to
It's something
Rabbanan,
like,
Oh.
Page
well,
12.
probably before 12 or 13.
which means probably page 12, because Kaddish to Rabbanan's page 13.
So yeah, it's probably 12. Lisa, you had your hand up, and I'm trying to see if it's in the Shabbat one in the meantime.
Yeah, I guess what this touches on for me is like, who gets to decide who gets to interpret Torah? Because in some ways it's saying that we each encounter Torah, and it's a process, and it keeps going, and every time we encounter it, we uncover new things. But then you're saying that there are boundaries on what the interpretation can be. So I don't know if these laws set out what those boundaries are, but it's interesting because conservative Judaism definitely places like boundaries on interpretation, like it's not even our rabbi. Some rulings are only made by the conservative movement, even though in this chapter it seems to be saying that you can do it by community.
So yeah, that's not entirely true in the conservative movement. The conservative
like
movement,
things about marriage and kashrut and Shabbat laws and things like that seem to be sort of set out by the RA.
So the conservative movement generally has some. There are a couple of standards of practice that, as a conservative rabbi who is a member of the rabbinical assembly, I am bound to observe. There's not a lot of them. There's like 3, but might even be 2 now. But I think there's 3. Now, the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards will provide halachic guidance and will say, based on the Torah, here are some legal guidance on certain questions based on our interpretation. But a conservative rabbi can say, well, that's not right for our community, and I'm not going to listen to that. Or it can say, I disagree with the committee's halachic position, and I'm not going to follow it. So there are positions you can negotiate, and you can decide what's best for your community, which is why there's still a handful of conservative communities that have mechitza up in a conservative synagogue, because that's what's right for their community. My synagogue I got married at, Orly and I got married at, used to have what we used to joke. We used to call them the bullpens, because it was a formerly Orthodox synagogue, and after they went conservative, they went egalitarian. They reserved like 2 or 3 rows on either side that were walled off, That was kind of the mechitza section for anyone who still wanted to sit there. And Orly used to call, and I used to call them the bullpens because that's kind of what they look like.
You could have called it the penalty boxes.
You could have called it the penalty box, but that that has a negative connotation there. And I'm not a big hockey person, so it wouldn't have come to me. By the way, Barbara Brandy, page 109 in the Shabbat Siddur.
Oh, okay. I just looked it up in an old one, and yes, it's there. But I thoroughly agree with Josh Richmond, who said, "Yeah, that's tough to understand." So
yes.
Now, tell me the page again in the
109.
109.
So, look, I will say, there are times I tried to give drashot when I was younger, even before rabbinical school, that didn't go particularly well because I didn't have the education to give a good interpretation. And I think that's a chunk of it is, being able to know enough of the Torah to be able to interpret it within the bounds of Judaism in a way that still fits within Jewish tradition, which I think we might get a little bit closer to as we keep reading through this.
So that's where I get stuck though. So our encounters with Torah, unless we're knowledgeable enough, don't really count as Torah.
I'll put it this way. I think they count towards your personal Torah.
Yeah.
But, how they fit into the larger tradition might be a different question. And I think, we can, I'd have to think a little more on that of, if I had an encounter that I wrote down, how would that encounter fit into the larger tradition on my own? I'd have to kind of think about that a little more.
Because we do want to encourage people to have their own personal encounters with Torah.
Yes, of course. Absolutely. Yes. 100%.
Yeah.
Barbara?
Well, I'm just thinking about it in terms of a secular legal document. We can read that and it can mean something to us and we can get something out of it. But that doesn't mean, I haven't gone to law school. I don't know. There's so much that I don't know that I wouldn't say, this is what the body of law says, or that's, it's just a different level. It's powerful it could be powerful to you, but it'd be hard for you to say, well, our synagogue, I think our synagogue needs to do this because I see, this one point.
Does that delegitimize interpretations that are done by someone who's not following all the rules? As somebody who writes a lot of Bar Torah discussions, gee, maybe I should quit my job doing that. Oh, Eddie's telling me yes. Go ahead and quit your job doing that.
Eddie, tell us how you really feel about her Divrei Torah. How about this? Let's table this for a moment. Let's maybe push through a little further into what Rabbi Artson is saying and see if he maybe elucidates a little more on this. And then if not, we can, dependent on time, we can try to circle back a little more. So, his first implication is that you can accept essentially a academic view of the Torah and how it was constructed without losing its divinity and divine or the divine nature of it. That's kind of the first implication and point that he's trying to make. The second is, and I think Barbara I think it was Barbara who said this before, is that number two, because we understand the Torah as a fusion of the divine and human, giving and receiving Torah is a process without end. That revelation is a mutual act. If God reveals God's self, it's the old philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, does it still make a sound? Right? Like if God reveals God's self and no one's paying attention, is it still revelation? And I think that's kind of the point he's making, is that there has to be a mutuality in revelation, that people have to receive what God is giving at the same as God is giving it, but that this doesn't actually end. And he says further down that paragraph, Scripture is always clothed in interpretation made real through active engagement. There's a great metaphor in the Zohar of the Torah being like a person wearing clothes. You don't assume something about who the person is and pretend you know everything about the person because of the clothes they're wearing. Similarly, you don't really know the Torah just by the words of the Torah on the page. You actually have to interpret and go beyond the Torah and what it's saying to get to actually understand what the Torah is trying to tell you. Which, if you're a Kabbalist and reading the Zohar, means something different than we might be discussing here today. But I think it's a good metaphor that the Torah gives you the clothing. You have to uncover what the Torah is actually trying to say. And again, kind of as I quoted Rabbi Dorff, Sinai is a symbol for an ongoing process without end, not just a particular moment at a particular mountain. That way the rabbis designed interpretation is that it's supposed to keep going. It's supposed to be ongoing. It's supposed to go without end, because otherwise you're reading a static document that was written thousands of years ago that has no meaning for us today. We have to keep interpreting it and engaging with it for it to have any relevance or make sense. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right. So the third point he makes, page 50 for those who have the book, number 3 for those who are reading on a Kindle. Faithfulness to the special revelation launched by the Torah requires affirmation that a cosmic wisdom fuels the Torah and commentaries given direction through us. I think where he's trying to argue here is I'll put it this way. People always say, I think we found the mountain on which Noah's Ark was landed, and this must be the mountain. Or I forgot what channel it was on. Was it History Channel? It was on something that tried to make an argument for tried to explain naturally why and how the 10 plagues could have happened. So, there was an earthquake that caused a giant dust storm that brought a bunch of dust into the Nile and made it turn red. And the change in the pH balance of the Nile made the frogs come out in droves. And, that led to this, and that led. Rabbi Artson's trying to say you read the Torah like that, you're missing the point. Barbara is saying no.
I'm saying no. I would use a different example, and that's the plague of darkness. We have geology evidence that shows a volcano erupting in the Mediterranean, it's like north of Egypt, which put out so much dust into the atmosphere that it blocked the sun. And the question is that enough to create the darkness for the extended period of time, a couple of days that it needed to be dark? And the answer is yes. So here's where I think some interpretations aren't willing to go to the connection between what you know from science and what you know from reading the Torah. And it's a different explanation according to some scientists about the color and the frogs and things like that. Somebody, and I can't quote the reference right off the top of my head, there are a couple of organizations that have looked particularly for scientific explanations for the plagues, which are a fairly easy one to make a connection between known science and that. But the eruption of Santorini just fits, the volcanic eruption for the plague of darkness. And I can send you a copy of my Devar Torah on that, which I'm sure is totally illegitimate because I don't know the 13 rules for interpretation. You're looking at it now. If Chumash says anything about it.
So, I was trying to check something else. Generally speaking, the Israelites are not affected by the rest of the plagues that the Egyptians are going through, even though they're living in Egypt. So,
They'll have flashlights.
Well, no, I think here's the better, is there a possibility that there are scientific things? Yes, but I think trying to dig into them misses the point the Torah is trying to make. And yes, there are volcanoes that could have erupted and could have done that. Absolutely. But that misses the point.
When you can find the deposit of the ash.
But it doesn't mean it happened exactly then or for exactly that long. It doesn't explain why Israelites could see. It probably wouldn't make it as dark as midnight for that long, at least not for only a few days. I mean, I think you can look for naturalistic explanations, but you can't ever definitively say that this one absolutely accords with that in all of the ways it's supposed to. You can say, sort of, maybe.
It's a possibility.
And look, Rabbi Artson is, one of the first ones who will say, yes, science and religion should work hand in hand with each other. He is a big defender of the relationship and interplay between science and religion. But I think the point he's trying to make here is when you go down those holes as a way of interpreting Torah, you're missing the point the Torah is trying to tell you. That, saying, well, the darkness was a volcanic eruption that made it dark for 3 days, does not guide you or tell you or help you try to figure out how to live your life now. And that's the point he's trying to make in this section, is to say, he says, the obligation is to recount these stories, to weave them into our lives and our generations. Pay attention to the wisdom in the story. That is the realm in which life-affirming significance can be found. The details are the frame through which the lesson can be taught. That's so I think that's what he's trying to argue is God directed these stories in a particular way to teach us something about how to live our lives. And we don't have to read it as natural history to be able to find it meaningful. And if, in fact, there's more in which if we don't read it as history, we can find a lot more meaning within it. Barbara Ayland had her hand up first.
Well, I want to defend Barbara Brandy by saying that while it is true that for some people going down that rabbit hole may obscure a deeper message, for some people having this proof may enhance the message. And I think the point that everything hits people differently is well taken. And it's a little too strong to say this is the wrong way to look at it, because we're all searching in our own way. Now, proving that it's true is maybe not enough. I mean, that, there's more to learn, but if that's the first step towards making it meaningful for you, I don't think we can say that that's not the way to go.
So I hear you. Here's my argument against that, though, is what if you can't prove it? Are you going to? And there are people who I've known some of them, and I've read some of them, and I've heard many of them who say, I can't prove that any of this actually happened, so why am I reading this?
Which I think is the why for coming up with non-Torah explanations for things, because this may be where you were going with that. There are lots of people who will reject this thinking, this isn't real. This isn't something that happened. This is just a made up story. And I think I certainly have used the terms made up story many times, as, the people who wrote it down had reasons for making up stories to tell us, the moral of the story, which is why I think finding out that there are real possibilities for explanations, not that they're proven, but real possibilities, brings it to a concrete piece of information that people can say, yeah, this could have happened.
And, you could also make a case that, as Joshua said, like, yes, a volcanic eruption could have done it, but you can't prove that volcanic eruption would have happened at the particular time that the Israelites were there. And so if I think the point I'm trying to make is, if you rely too much on proving it historically, when you fall into a point you can't, and you will fall into a point you can't. We can't prove Abraham's existence archaeologically, historically. There's nothing. There's no evidence. Same for Moses, for that matter, or pretty much anything before King David. We don't have archaeological evidence really proving a lot of it. So at what point do you say, maybe there's something else here without having to dig into the historical accuracy of it? Joshua?
I was to say, I don't think it's wrong to look for naturalistic explanations, but I think you also need to keep in mind what I hear in science all the time of absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So if it helps you believe parts of it to say, some of these outlandish things, I can see ways in which there are naturalistic explanations, or could be natural explanations, that's good if it helps bring you closer to it. But I think it is harmful, I guess, which is kind of what the rabbi was saying. If for things that you can't find evidence, you decide that it must be worthless, then I think that's taking you further away from it, and that's where it becomes harmful.
Yeah, and I don't think I ever said wrong, that this was a wrong interpretation.
Yeah, no, I didn't think you did either.
No, I think Barbara had also said it also. So I don't think I said it was wrong. I think I'm pointing out that there's a danger in relying on that as a method of interpretation. And so, personally for me, I see, when I don't read it historically, And I try to read it as, what can this teach me about living my life today? It doesn't really matter if there was a volcanic eruption or not. It matters that there's something I can learn from this in this moment. At least that's how I read it. Eddie, you were going to say something.
Yeah. So, what Rabbi Artson is trying to say is we aren't required to believe these stories literally. And he says in here that the Torah doesn't require that, but we are required to tell the stories, and that in the hope that we'll gain something from the stories. Because if you think about it, Moses didn't have a way to prove to Pharaoh that God caused the locust or the darkness. He only had to get Pharaoh to believe it. He didn't have to prove that, and there was no way for him to prove it. So there's no way we can prove in our time either. We just have to use it.
Yeah, I think you summed it up well. What Rabbi Artson says is what the Torah demands is that we affirm these stories' significance, not their putative truth. That we acknowledge, true or not, that they have something to teach us. And our obligation is to fashion lives and communities that reflect these commandments through the core values they seek to establish: human dignity, justice, compassion, and holiness. So, if digging into the history helps you build a community that establishes dignity, justice, compassion, and holiness, gezeh gesundheit. But you don't need to go down that path in order to do so.
I would just like to add one thing, and that is that you can't get hung up on the word prove. There are too many ways that you can't prove, but I'm interested in suggesting things that help me to think, hey, it might have happened.
So only because we're running low on time, I want to make sure we get to the rest here. Number 4, the Torah is meant to be the first word, not the last. I feel like this kind of ties into 2, that we're supposed to keep interpreting. It's supposed to be a basis for interpretation. And we're supposed to, for all eternity, keep coming back to it to interpret it again and again and again in our time in order to keep it relevant to where we are today. That we should, as he says at the end of that section, we should be empowered to read boldly, willing to make the interpretations needed in our own time for God's love and justice to shine more brightly through our words of Torah. So that we're not supposed to rely on just everything that's happened in the past, but continue interpreting it along into what fits us today. Quickly going to 5, ethics takes precedence. He relies heavily on the prophets here. That the prophets continuously come, and he quotes Isaiah. This is a good quote from Isaiah, so I can't blame him for that. But Isaiah is not the only one who makes the argument that God doesn't really care how ritually observant you are if you're treating other people horribly, and if you're corrupt, and if you're acting unjustly, doesn't really matter. I've shared a couple times, I think recently, this concept the rabbis have of a nevel birshut Torah, which is usually translated a scoundrel within the bounds of Torah. What it generally refers to is somebody who is perfectly halachically observant and still a jerk. And the way you can do that within the Torah, where you can follow the halakha closely, but still be an awful human being. And Rabbi Artson's trying to argue the Torah, particularly the prophets, and he quotes Isaiah again. In the Haftarah we read importantly, we read it on Yom Kippur, saying, I don't really care what you do ritually if you're going to be awful. That the Torah teaches us we need to be ethical first and ritually observant second. He says, the fashioning societies of justice and compassion is our core religious commitment, and that ritual plays a secondary role to ethical rigor. That's I think, an important point of where he's going. Questions, thoughts before we go to his sixth point. But
one question I had about that is like, and I guess I have a hard time sometimes understanding, to what extent is that part of core process theology, or is that just sort of Rabbi Artson saying this is how I am interpreting things?
My book started falling and the page ripped as I was catching it. So the way he phrases it at the beginning of number 5, understanding revelation through the perspective of process thought restores an ancient priority often diminished in modern times, the priority of the ethical over the ritual in Jewish tradition. He doesn't really give a process angle at it as much as the prophetic and the Jewish angle of it, which I think does not entirely answer your question, only because I'm not sure he entirely answers it there.
Yeah, okay. I wasn't quite sure how much it follows from process so much as it's Judaism.
Yeah, he's interpreting it from process, and I think it might tie back into the question we had last week of, if I can find it, where he says, it's on page 43 if you have the actual book. Only those events that optimize love, justice, compassion, relationship offer revelatory possibility. And I said, I don't know exactly where he's coming up with that, unless it's just a basic underlying premise of what he's saying generally.
Yeah, and it's also just weird because you don't really know what optimize means. It's kind of like utilitarian ethics. You don't actually ever know what highest utility of anything is. Okay.
So that's how I'm reading it, unless Barbara has a better.
Well, look, I'm all about ethics being more important than ritual, because that's kind of how I was raised. But I don't really see Judaism saying that. And I think his proof from Isaiah doesn't necessarily say ethics is more important. It's saying it's equally important. Like, you can't do the ritual without having the ethics. But he's not saying, and I feel like Rabbi Artson is implying that he's saying you can have the ethics without the ritual, and that would be better than. And I don't think that Isaiah said that. I mean, he's saying you have to do both. You can't just do the ritual meaninglessly.
Yes. Isaiah is primarily arguing against empty ritualization. Yes. The way I often describe it, and some of you may have heard me say this before, is, part of the function of ritual is to remind us of our obligation and our place in the world, and to remind us of God's presence in this world, and remind us of our obligations and what God asks of us in this world. So in some sense, ritual should remind us and cause us to act better because of it. And acting better and acting out those obligations should make us want to do the rituals more, to continue to reflect on what God is asking of us. And it works as kind of a circle together, and a cycle together. So I don't think Rabbi Artson is suggesting by any means we need to get rid of ritual. but I think he's following the same argument that um, we need to, you need the ritual, but you need the ethics more. And he gives some other examples of where the rabbis tried to do that. But back to Joshua's question, I'm not entirely clear I get where he's coming from a Jewish perspective, not necessarily where he's getting it from a process perspective, other than it's just one of the underlying premises of his arguments generally. And I think the last point goes back to Lisa's question earlier, that process theology stresses pluralism in practice. So for each person, for every created event, there is a lure distinctive and unique. No two moments offer the same opportunity, and no two individuals stand in the same situation with identical needs. So that it follows then that we need to create room for a pluralistic implementation of shared revelation and values. And we learn that halakha follows the most recent authority and that judges can only rule according to what their own eyes see. So I think this goes back to Lisa's question before of what is our experience of revelation and how does it fit into the tradition? And he says everybody's going to have a different revelation and everybody's going to interpret based on their own personal experiences. They're going to experience that revelation differently, and we need to make space for everybody's interpretations along the way. Does that better answer your question, Lisa?
Yes, but it doesn't answer my thoughts about the conservative Judaism mandates certain things like such as intermarriage. And in my version of Torah that I encounter, I see it differently. But it doesn't allow me to have that interpretation. He's gone. Oh, there you are. Oh, no, somebody left. Okay. Anyway, it doesn't allow, conservative Judaism isn't allowing me that interpretation of Torah as I encounter it. Because I think it's actually a more, it could be seen also as an ethical argument.
So, there's a lot of there's a lot of arguments and discussions around intermarriage. And I'm not going to
we don't need to veer off into that.
And we're not going to go all, but here's one of them, which is really kind of, I think, central to the point is, Jewish marriage is a Jewish legal ceremony. And in fact, what do you say when you hand over the ring? Hare at mekudeshet li b'taba'at zo kadat Moshe v'Yisrael. You are betrothed to me through this ring according to the law of Moses and Israel. So what do you do with a legal ceremony that one of the people is not part of? Is not a member, is not part of that, is not ascribed to that legal system? How do you maintain, part of from a halachic issue, part of the question is how do you have a halachic ceremony that somebody, at least one of the partners is not part of, does not subscribe to halakha? I don't know the answer to that question. It's kind of like saying, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example, but
Well, I was going to say, we require, if people are living in this country, even if they're not American citizens, we require them to follow the laws.
Correct. But we can't exactly do that in Judaism anyway.
Right. But then there's the ethical argument of welcoming the stranger.
Correct. And I guess
and the arguments of Ruth, and there's a lot of arguments you could make. But anyway, like I said, it just seems to negate my encounter, like my ability to encounter Torah and make and chart my life based on my encounters with Torah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think those who would disagree with you would say, is there a way to welcome the stranger without doing a ceremony? Like, you can still be loving and welcoming and caring and not do a ceremony. But I'm not saying I'm saying that. I'm just saying like that's just I've heard that argument, and now I've heard that counter argument against it. You're right. It's not a simple. I'll put it this way. I say this. I've been saying this a lot lately because it keeps coming up in different contexts. This phrase keeps coming up. If it was a simple solution, we would have done it already. If there was an easy way to do it that still, particularly for the Orthodox, just say there's no way to do it because it's not halachic. And conservative, as a movement, the conservative movement has largely been saying the same thing. Like, how do we do this in a way that's still halachic? And nobody's been able to really pin down that answer yet. Joshua, you were going to say something.
I don't know if I should say. I was thinking, I guess I'm sort of trying to put my finger on the trouble I have, and part of it is that in some sense it opens the door to a very, very anarchic view of spirituality, where if you make everyone's encounter with Torah partnership with God and revelation, we're sort of back with what some people were asking last week of, to the extent that you are sincere and you believe that what you're saying is truly inspired and following your encounter with Torah, there is nobody to tell you otherwise. So I think it really does essentially open the floodgates to get rid of tradition in a lot of ways. As long as you're sincere, they feel like there's no reason you should be bound by what anyone else says.
Right. Yeah, I can see that, but I think it's like, where do you set those? Where are those boundaries? I guess that's what we wrestle with, is where are those boundaries?
But I think what
I
this
feel
does
like
is
there's a personal
gate, but doesn't set that.
I feel like there's a personal relationship and then there's a communal relationship. So to me, that's the difference.
So I'll say two things to this kind of quickly. One is, yes, we're all kind of having our own interpretation, but we're all basing it on the same foundational texts. And in some way, those texts are what binds us together, even if we're disputing interpretations. Much the same way that the Talmudic rabbis would read the same text and dispute with each other based on what they thought was happening and what their interpretation of the revealed text was. They'd read the same thing and come to very different conclusions sometimes. But ultimately, they were bound by the same principal desires of, one, better understanding God's will as revealed through the text, and two, trying to figure out how to live life based on that revelation. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'll say is he has a whole nother chapter on Revelation later, and how do we build community based on this. So, this is not the end of the conversation. This is the foundation for the conversation that's going to come back in, I looked a minute ago, I think it's chapter 11 or 12 or something. I looked 12. Revelation and a living relationship of love, an open-ended Torah, and building holy community. So, hopefully when we get to chapter 12, he'll maybe answer and address some of that concern as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Any closing thoughts, comments? Hola kavod, everyone. Thank you for learning together. Thank you for your good questions and challenging questions and your passion. And next week we'll move on. Death and the afterlife. And then after that, we're ready to get to part 2, where he really tries to address some of these questions more layered into Judaism specifically, rather than based on process theology as a general whole. So hopefully some of these questions we keep circling back to over and over again. Hopefully some of those will get answered in part 2 of the book. And if not, I'll give you his email and you can email him. No, I'm just joking. We'll continue learning one way or the other. But kol hakavod. If I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom, and stay warm. And if I don't see you even then I'll see you by next week. So stay well, everybody. Stay warm.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Be well.